Okay, thank you.
Thanks, man.
Okay, I'm not sure what I did to offend Ian to have him put me first.
You impressed me.
He knows I have the most to learn here, so we'll get this out of the way and then I can learn. I should also begin by saying that I'm a political theorist in a political science department, and the audience for this paper are my fellow political scientists who are basically ignoring the issue of suicide. None of them are talking about it, and so my aim is to try to change that, and to try, of course, to change the public policy area dealing with suicide. So much of what I'm going to say is probably not going to be all that new to many of you, but nonetheless. In the context of steadily increasing rates of suicide in the United States, everyone seems to agree that suicide is a public health crisis. However, the recognition of a public health problem does not seem to entail the idea that suicide is a political problem that reaches into the background conditions of life for citizens and does so in ways that are differentially distributed by social and political standing. While states today properly spend critical resources to help respond to individuals in crisis, states have not shown a willingness to see the patterns and concentrations of suicidal persons within their jurisdictions as a feature of their political, ethical, and legal responsibility. Vulnerability to suicide is essentially thought to reside within the mind and complex personal and emotional life of individuals. In this respect, state leaders merely follow the lead of most of the psychiatric professionals who work in the field of suicidology today. This paper that I'm presenting advances the argument that that's a mistake, or at least an approach that needs a political and structural reorientation. So the thesis of the paper is that our understanding and our approach to suicide must advance further upstream, meaning that citizens and leaders need to assess and to intervene on the formation of vulnerabilities to suicide much earlier than is usually the case. In accordance with this view, the paper advances, the risk factors for suicide don't simply refer to individuals in cognitive, emotional, and behavioral distress. The risk factors for suicide should also refer to the structural conditions in which people live, especially conditions that are marked by the intersections of poverty and various forms of social and political marginalization by race, class, age, and sexuality. Since these structural conditions are powerfully influenced by policy regimes and policy effects, a structural assessment of suicide risk will point us in the direction of a political and institutional approach to the prevention of suicide, whose primary aim, as I see it, is to end the making of vulnerability to suicide through policy regimes, and this usually means policy neglect, as I'm going to try to show. So the specific purpose of this paper is to marshal at least some of the evidence upon which a political institutional approach to suicide might be grounded. So it's in three parts. Part one highlights what I see are the limits of existing social science research regarding suicide, where here in this particular part I'm looking critically at a lot of recent work in sociology, and I'll largely skip that portion. Part two, the part I'll really focus on, begins to try to assemble some of the evidence, some of the variables, some of the data that might be employed to show how states make vulnerability to suicide. And that section also starts to point in the direction of more upstream policies that states could pursue to help reduce vulnerability. And then part three, the final section, begins to think about connections between this approach and how it might supplement dominant psychological approaches to theories about suicide. So part one of the paper, just really briefly, it's called Reintegrating City and Soul in the Study of Suicide. And the basic point here is that a false bifurcation dominates our understanding of suicide and frames our approach to it. This bifurcation is one that separates and decontextualizes the individual from the structural and political conditions of human life, and then seeks to treat suicidal subjects through various psychological, therapeutic, pharmacological means. While most scholars in the behavioral sciences, especially sociology, psychology, and political science, recognize that there are a host of social and environmental factors that shape the personal and the psychological lives of individuals, this recognition rarely insinuates itself into a political or institutional consideration of public policy actions that structure the constitutive conditions of human life. And I think that's especially true in the case of the study of suicide, and I'd show that through a critical reading of some recent work by scholars in sociology. The bottom line there is that still today, after all these years, they are largely following Durkheim, emphasizing social integration, disintegration. And I learn a lot from that work, there's no doubt. But in my view, social integration, social disintegration is not itself a sufficient explanation, and certainly not an exhaustive one, because these dimensions have upstream public policies, have upstream relations to public policies related to economic development, job training, income support, affordable housing, family medical leave, adequate education, and much else besides. Sociologists, I think, are certainly right to point to the social forces that undermine human well-being, but these social forces themselves can be traced to political structures and agents that bear responsibility for them. And until citizens and leaders close that door, close that sort of blindness to the constitution of social forces, or the bad faith that they have no contribution to those social forces, then I think we will always lack a kind of political level of analysis in this particular area. And under those conditions, as feminist scholars would point out, a form of political consciousness about suicide that could help to mobilize a sense of shared responsibility for addressing it will have difficulty coming to life in our discourse and in our approach to these problems. To be fair to the sociologists, political scientists are not even talking about this, or at least they're further than we are, and so we have a lot to learn from them. And as I said, I'm trying to push my colleagues to care about this. So hence part two, and this is where these tables begin to come in. What evidence is there to lend support to the idea that vulnerability to suicide is made by policy regimes? This is where I try to begin to assemble some evidence. And it began with just the basic idea, let's take the top 10 states in the United States with the highest rates of suicide. In the United States right now, 13.26 per 100,000 is the current rate in the US, but all of these states have substantially higher rates of suicide. And I just said, well, what's different about these states? What's unique to them? What marks them as different? And by the way, Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon could also oftentimes be on this list depending upon the year. It fluctuates annually. Why do these states, nearly all located in the western part of the United States, have such high rates of suicide? What's different about them relative to the rest of the country? What points of evidence might help us unravel these questions? And here I'm just beginning to sort of lay out a kind of circumstantial case. And it is, of course, circumstantial. And it will need to be augmented by more qualitative study, the kind of local knowledge that Jennifer White talks about in that quote that you provided. And I begin just by looking at poverty. I look at firearm regulations, mental health, and party structure. And my hope is that you start to build a strong enough circumstantial case that even in a court of law you can prevail if the circumstantial case is strong enough. And that's effectively what I'm at least trying to do in this first stab with the data. And so you've got at least the first 6 here. There's another group here as well, if I can click over to it. Some additional ones as well. So what I'm doing here is utilizing US Census Bureau data for income and poverty estimates for all ages in poverty, and then cross-referencing that with data on suicide. And we can compare this at a state level, and we can also, of course, compare it at a county level, and I have another table that does that more fine-grained county level analysis. Comparing those counties with the highest rates of suicide with county level poverty information shows that while there is not a strict one-to-one relationship between high levels of poverty and high rates of suicide in all cases, there's nonetheless a very robust, statistically significant relationship in these variables across many states and counties. And then when you take a closer look at county level data, as I begin to do here, high suicide rates relative to both in-state percentages and annualized national suicide rates They don't depend on poverty. But in almost all cases, high rates of poverty correlate with significantly higher rates of suicide. In 31 counties analyzed within 6 states, Wyoming, Alaska, Montana, New Mexico, Utah, South Dakota, 17 counties with rates of poverty hovering around 20% also had significantly higher rates of suicide than the rest of the state. And 20 counties here with poverty rates of around 20% had suicide rates higher than the annualized US rate. It's also important to point out that in those counties and states with the most disturbing connection between poverty and suicide are counties in which American Indians, Alaskan Natives constitute the majority of those suicides, as you can start to see in some of this data. This points, I think, in an important direction to the idea that, thank you, there's a need at the state and at county level involvement in establishing and sustaining programs that address localized pockets of poverty as a public policy means of reducing suicide. Now I augment this data with a variety of other measures, income support, per capita overall spending. I won't inundate you with all that, but all of those measures show, so in Wyoming, Montana, Oklahoma, for example, they have some of the lowest rates of income support. We also have in these states some of the lowest levels of per capita spending on their population. Going back, I also wanted to look at firearms, access to firearms. Since 50% of all suicides in the United States come from the use of firearms. 9 out of the 10 states on this list received a failing score by the Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence for having extraordinarily weak gun laws and correspondingly high rates of gun death. The types of laws that we're talking about here to assess a state's overall score relative to the regulation of firearms include whether states require background checks for private sales of firearms, require mental health records to be submitted, impose liability on people who negligently store firearms, or allow family members or law enforcement to petition to withdraw or to disarm persons who are deemed a threat to themselves or others. By contrast, the 6 states with the sort of grade A on firearm regulation all have the lowest suicide rates in the country. And so you begin, again, to see your sort of pattern here. Mental health, it's the same sort of story. Utilizing Mental Health America data to measure a community's mental health needs, access to care, and outcomes. Lower rankings relative to the 50 states indicate that adults and youth have higher prevalence of mental illness and lower rates of access to care. 7 out of these 10 states, again, with the highest rates of suicide, were in the bottom third of all states for higher prevalence of mental health issues and lower access to care for both adults and for youth. And we can talk more about all of that. I'm just giving you a sense of what I'm trying to assemble here. So the other part of all this that's interesting to me as a political scientist is that these are pretty much all Republican states. Now, what do you do about that? Here's what I try to do about that. They're all controlled by Republican Party. I should say 7 out of the 10 states are controlled by Republican Party. 2 additional states, Colorado and Alaska, Republicans control the Senate. And many of these states, of course, are not only controlled by Republicans, but have long-lasting legacies and histories of Republican control. What relevance does that have? Well, these are states whose political and philosophical center of gravity is a combination of federalism. In the American setting, that means emphasizing sort of local state control, and a diffuse mixture of liberalism, or libertarianism really, and neoliberalism, where we're talking about a commitment to rolling back the state in areas like the economy, the health sector, the environment, and much else besides. This broad philosophy of governance is embedded within a Western political ecosystem that is anchored by the mythos of individual autonomy, self-reliance, and personal responsibility for one's place in the social scheme of things. In light of these ideological currents, very well ossified by now, suicide prevention is going to also have to require a work on social norms and cultural scripts that facilitate and encourage individuals, and I think especially men, to suffer stoically in silence in response to diminished economic prospects, ill health, and social marginalization. I have some ideas about how that social norm agenda might get kicked off. Part of it means taking the table data that I'm providing here and turning it into a legislative scorecard and holding politicians accountable for it. There's another dimension to it where I try to utilize conservative philosophies of the sanctity of life and get them to care about suicide, because all these states actually make it illegal to seek physician-assisted suicide. That tells you how much they enjoy playing God in these states. And so if that's true, if the sanctity of life is so important, then it seems ex hypothesi, they should also care about this. And I think we might have some leverage there, politically, rhetorically speaking, on that point. But I think I have like 5 minutes left, so let me exactly. So let me wrap up philosophically here with what I think the contribution of this overall approach might be, integrating theory with practice. The question here is, how do we conceptualize this political institutional approach to suicide? One way to do so is to supplement an influential existing account of suicide in psychology, which goes by the name of the fluid vulnerability theory, which is an elaboration of Beck's modal theory of psychopathology, which examines temporal fluctuations and interactions of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors over time to identify individuals of increased risk of suicide. The starting point for this whole account, of course, is the idea that individuals have a baseline risk of suicide that is comprised of various cognitive vulnerabilities and personal characteristics that develop within the individual. Individuals with multiple risk factors, then, for suicide have a higher baseline risk for suicide, and a consequence of this, an acute life stressor or time-sensitive perturbation can precipitate suicidal conduct, or a suicidal mode for those persons. Okay, so that's a very dominant understanding. It's compelling in many ways. A political, institutional perspective on this count would add the following analytic and normative points, and this is just by way of sort of concluding. One, the individual baseline risk for suicide is not an individual characteristic alone, but is shaped by the complex interactions of social economic determinants along with personal and psychological characteristics. And those interactions have powerful upstream political forces at work, which I'm beginning to try to assemble here. That's one point. The second point is that the baseline risk for suicide may, of course, vary by individual, yet the baseline risk for some groups, American Indians and Alaskan Natives, LGBT youth, poor rural whites, the elderly, military personnel, these groups are subject to more of these inflationary pressures than others. And these pressures are, again, partially the product of public policy action and inaction in domains like poverty alleviation, income support, family support services, access to mental health services, and much else besides. Those 2 points in combination, I think, then lead to the normative claim, which is that acute life stressors that prompt an active suicidal mode should be subject to political, institutional contextualization and political mobilization to resist them. Thank you.
Thank you.